Respected Dr. Alak, dignitaries on dais, friends, ladies and gentlemen. My gratitude to Amit and the Star Agri team for inviting me to speak here and share some thoughts. I'm really here today in the capacity of a learner because it's rare to meet such a large cross-section of stakeholders, especially in agriculture. And perhaps I speak out of turn in the presence of Dr. Alak, who is one of the doyens of the Indian agricultural policy making space. Many of us have benefited from his wisdom over the years. And I have the great privilege of sitting on various committees and meetings where listening to him is like, seeing an illumination of so many aspects of this, I think, very poorly understood space. So some of the stereotypes of India in as far as agriculture is concerned, which I'm sure this audience need not be reminded of. 14 crore households, the largest such number in the world even today. China has less people in agriculture than India. Almost 70 crore people still depend on agriculture. Almost half the workforce in agriculture. And yet, this half the workforce supporting the 70 crore population contributes only 14% of the GDP of the country. There's a World Bank study of 2009 which estimated that the per capita contribution of an agricultural worker to the GDP in US dollar terms in 2009 is around $600 per capita. So one agricultural worker, on an average, people like Ajay Jhakar are exceptions, but the average agricultural household worker is contributing about $600 per capita to the GDP per year. The average non-agricultural worker, which is I think most people in this room, certainly all the people on this dais, contributes $2,400 per capita per annum to the national GDP. If you think this is bad news, the real bad news is that this gap is diverging. So the people who are contributing $2,400 per capita are going to be rising at a much faster rate than the people contributing $600. And I think besides all the economics of it, as citizens, we need to be concerned that this is a recipe for an unsustainable model of growth, and it's also perhaps a recipe for potential social conflict. So how do we address this? And since the issue here, and I'll try and keep to the subject, which is commodity financing, which I would like to interpret to mean agriculture commodity financing, I'd like to ask two questions. And I'm asking this question of myself, and I'm also asking these two questions of the audience, and I hope through the course of the morning when I'll be here, we'll perhaps have some answers. So my first question, and somebody who's worked primarily in the government, but I also served for 5 years in the UN in an agency called IFAD, and I saw a lot of African and South American models. And to my surprise, despite the importance of agriculture in our country, the innovation in financing instruments is actually much narrower compared to several countries in Africa and also in South America. So my first question is, how is it that traditional channels of agri-commodity financing have survived so far into our independent history? So in our 68th year, how is it that the RBI's latest document says that only 15% of small and marginal farmers are able to access institutional finance? And my understanding of commodity financing, in fact, starts from the very basic credit for agriculture. Because without access to institutional credit for agriculture, you cannot expect a downstream segment which is a specialized segment like agri-commodity financing to play a role which is significant. So I see it as part of the larger institutional finance structure which is very weak. So my first question is, how come the traditional structures and traditional channels of agri-commodity financing have survived? And how come our modern financial institutions have not been able to penetrate this space? And obviously that derives a second question. So what is required to increase this penetration of this modern, these modern instruments, this modern, shall we say, pattern of financing? Now to understand, or to at least give you my take on, or my understanding of these two questions, I'd like to highlight three concurrent challenges that our agriculture faces at the current point. Let's forget about all the terrific things that have been done. 50 million tons of food grains in 1950. Now we are almost 270. Yes, of course, there are a huge number of pluses. And as I said, doyens like Professor Alag have much to contribute to that success. But we are talking about in 2015, three very significant challenges facing our agriculture. Number one, and this surprises people when I say this, including many of my colleagues in government, our agriculture today is essentially market driven. And I'm willing to be challenged by somebody on this, but I can back this up. There's any amount of evidence that supports what I'm saying. About 15 years ago, 3/4 of the value of the agri-GDP was made up of staples like grains, pulses, oilseeds. Okay? So if 100 rupees is the value, total value of the Indian agri-GDP, 75 rupees came from these staples. And only 25 rupees came from what we call high-value agriculture, which is horticulture, poultry, dairy, livestock, fisheries. Today, the situation is exactly the reverse. 3/4 of the value of the agri-GDP comes from high-value agriculture. And the share of staples has been reduced to 1/4. Now what does that mean? All these items that I'm talking about, whether it's vegetables, fruits, meat, eggs, fish, milk, these are primarily driven by market demand. So as consumer preferences have changed, as the nature of the market demand has changed, the private sector, which is a lot of you sitting in this room, has transmitted those signals back to farmers who have adapted and changed their cropping patterns, adopted new technologies, shifted into sectors where they did not work earlier, and they are seeking to leverage this growing market demand. So this misconception that the government is the essential driver of agriculture, I think needs to be revised. Today, if you take a gross number, and I'm simplifying it for argument's sake, the total production of all the crops of India, including fruit crops and vegetable crops, is around 900 million tons in 1 year. Okay? 900 million metric tons is the total output in physical gross terms. Of that, the government is a player in about 70 to 80 million tons, which is the wheat and rice that the government buys for the PDS system. Less than 10% of the total output of this country is actually controlled by the government. Over 90% is actually controlled by private agents like you. So this is to buttress the first point that today's agriculture is a commercialized agriculture. But while this is a very positive development, there is a downside to it. And the downside is that the bulk of our producers are small or marginal. In fact, 65% of all farmers in this country are marginal, which means they have land holding of less than 1 hectare. Mr. Rajesh Thakur is not part of that, I'm happy to say. And the remaining 20% have around another maybe hectare. So we say small meaning up to 5 acres or 2 hectares, and marginal meaning less than 1 hectare means less than 2.5 acres. Now, while these people are trying to tap into these market opportunities that are growing, they do not have either the access to institutional finance, the access to technology, the access to extension services, and the access to markets which would make this growing opportunity really beneficial to them. So as agriculture has commercialized, so has the risk for the small producers grown. We could spend a day, I could give you a case study on how cotton farmers in rain-fed parts of Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, now Telangana, took to these advanced technologies like BT cotton merely to benefit from the growing demand and the high prices, but without the coverage of risks which would justify these shifts in cultivation patterns. The most tragic consequences of this, you read sometimes, the statistics of farmer suicides, and that is nothing but the failure of the market and also the failure of the government to provide an adequate safety net, to introduce enough risk mitigation measures to enable these farmers to benefit from these new commercial opportunities. So, challenge number one, how do we make commercialization of agriculture equitable, sustainable, and socially inclusive? So there's a question I'm throwing at you. The second related part of this, the second big crisis which I call, is the human resource crisis in agriculture. Now, part of the reason why costs have grown, especially in rain-fed regions, is because able-bodied men have physically moved out of these regions in search of better wage opportunities. At a macro level for the economy, this is a good thing. Especially about 5-6 years ago, when the real estate sector was booming, when construction was booming, people were moving out of village jobs where maybe 100, 150 rupees per day was the going rate for unskilled labor, to nearby cities where the starting rate was around 300 or 350 rupees. And that makes sense because that enabled a remittance economy. Bihar's growth is a classic example of how remittances have enabled the state to stay afloat despite the lack of growth in the underlying real economy. But that has created a huge human resource crisis in agriculture in many parts of the country. Not everywhere, but in many parts of the country. We still don't have a solution. Now that is also a kind of risk that needs to be addressed. And the third, I would say the third challenge, and here I stand among the guilty party, and perhaps Dr. Alak's generation did its share, but having moved on, perhaps have not been replaced by that same vision that perhaps prevailed in the 80s and 90s. And the third challenge I call the challenge of an unstable policy environment. So Amit mentioned pulses, so the government has to take some immediate knee-jerk reactions. Let's impose curbs, let's bring some imported pulses and dump it in the market. About a month ago, if you recall, onion was the flavor of the day, or not the so nice flavor of the day. And so there were curbs on exports, the minimum export price was put up. My agency was involved in, distributing onion in Delhi. So you see the tendency towards short-term ad hoc policy measures and not medium-term or long-term measures at all, because as Kane said, in the long term we are all dead. Governments have a horizon of 5 years. Not everything is possible in 5 years. So let's do what will give us relief in the next 3 to 6 months. Now, why am I placing this discussion in this context? And I'll now try and put forth to you my understanding of why, given this context, the modern financial instruments like agri-commodity financing have not taken off. So, my, of course, experience is largely in Madhya Pradesh, where I worked for 20 years, and I'm happy to say 13 of those 20 years were spent in agriculture. And this holds true of most of the rain-fed regions. And I call this a clash between what I call rural commercial capital, or RCC, and modern financial capital, or MFC. So what is RCC? The big farmer, the mandi agent, the money lender. These are the traditional channels of agricultural financing in these backward regions. And that makes sense, because these are the people who had any surplus which could be exchanged for capital. The bulk of the producers or cultivators needed cash to buy inputs, to buy labor, to attend to consumption needs. And so these people were the primary providers of capital for consumption and for investment needs. So I call this the RCC. Modern financial capital, represented, let us say, initially by the cooperatives, later by banks, also MFIs, and the growing new tribe of agriculture commodity financiers, are finding it very, very difficult to penetrate into the hinterland with these new products. Why is that so? One answer is very obvious. Rural commercial capital is available at the doorstep. It's available from people that you know, you have a history of perhaps relationship, at least social relationship, or you live in the same village. There is minimal paperwork. It's almost hassle-free. It's available around the clock. If you have a death in the family, the money lender will even give you money at midnight for your social needs. Modern financial capital, on the other hand, it appears to be more cumbersome. It's more remote and distant. It involves complicated processes and paperwork, which in any case the rural population is extremely wary about. And so perceptionally, though RCC may be more exploitative in the sense of the kind of terms it sets, NFC is in fact perceived to be the less friendly and the less, shall we say, farmer-oriented instrument. Over the course of the last 3 or 4 decades, the government tried various measures to try and force RCC to retreat and MFC to increase its presence in the rural areas. Dr. Alag has witnessed the initial burst of enthusiasm when the cooperatives were first introduced in the village. Now, in a traditional feudal setup, the cooperatives were actually a very revolutionary idea, and they offered the hope that a channel of, shall we say, more rule-based funding would be available, or rule-based investment finance would be available. But as we all know, over a period of time, the RCC mobilized political support and managed to capture most of these cooperative structures, and in fact turned their whole orientation away from serving the needs of the majority of the cultivators to very different ends, but that's another story. Bank nationalization was also an attempt by the government to try and force institutional finance into the rural areas. But despite the fact that we have something like 1.3 lakh bank branches in the country, about a third of which are in the rural areas, we've not been able to, in fact, fully vanquish RCC. A third wave with institutions like NABARD, the hope was that by introducing ideas like refinancing, we'd be able to create a new class of financial institutions. That also failed. So now we are finally, in 2015, looking at the market to provide us with solutions. And the market is facing the same kind of problems. I just had a brief word with a young colleague from Star Agri, and he was telling me that, look, Madhya Pradesh, we are facing the maximum problems, and I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised that though on paper you are offering something which is required by the majority of cultivators, which policy is supposed to encourage, but the political economy works against the expansion of these new instruments. So we would really like to hear from some of you, given your experience, your expertise, and your insights, why or how can we look to expand this space for modern financial capital in our rural economy? Because without doing that, there is no way that we are going to be able to achieve the 4% growth rate which from Dr. Alag's time we have set for agriculture, and which we only achieved once in the last plan period, but which in the current plan period looks nowhere near even getting maybe even to the halfway mark. So look forward to hearing you, and I have to close in 2 minutes. So I'll give you my, shall I say, 5 pointers. So I call it my Panchasheel, my 5 ideas for, and these I call a prerequisite for enabling institutional finance, including commodity financing, but starting from, so my vision is that instead of calling it commodity financing, we call it value chain financing. And it has to start from agricultural credit. It has to have a package of financial services which includes savings, which includes personal and crop insurance, which includes, of course, things like warehouse receipts, but which also looks at new innovative instruments. There is some talk, but I know very little action on things like future contracts, etc. But ultimately, this whole chain of instruments will have to be offered in an interlinked form, like a garland. You cannot offer a single rose in the shape of these instruments to the farmer. He'll smell it, but unfortunately he won't be able to use it. So here's my punchline before I end. The first, and please refer to the first statement I made. With 14 crore farm households, there is no way any market player or the government can target these individual households with any bouquet of services. So aggregation of producers is the first prerequisite of enabling the penetration of institutional finance. My agency in the last 5 years has helped to promote around 1,000 producer companies across the country. Again, a legislation in which Dr. Alag had a very major role. He drafted the original idea and the legislation, and I can say that my little contribution has been in the last 5 years to convince many state governments, at least I would say in about 12, 13 states, the idea has been embedded. But of course, we are a long way. These 1,000 odd producer companies, between them, barely have mobilized around 20 lakh farmers. So 14 crores versus 20 lakh, so you do the math. But that is an essential prerequisite of trying to address the financial service needs, including commodity financing needs of our rural producers. The second, very important in my view, which is to address the HR crisis. And that today can only be done by a massive national mission on mechanization. Today, the biggest service that you would give to a small producer is to give him access to a tractor just to plow his land. The majority of small producers are not even able to hire a tractor. Forget about owning. A person owning 2 or 3 acres of land should certainly not own a tractor. It's basically unviable, even with a subsidy. But certainly there could be machinery banks, there could be innovative ways of hiring out, advanced machinery. So mechanization is a second. Third, again we don't talk about it, it's fallen off the policy discussion radar, and that's the idea of land leasing. NSS data shows that more than 80% of small and marginal farmers are leasing in land. Except for 2 states in this country, no state allows legal leasing of land. Now that's absurd. If somebody comes to Mumbai for the first time and gets a job, you can go and hire a flat on rent, depending on your capacity to pay. But if I am a farmer and I would like to lease in land to increase my holding, operational holding, except for 2 states, the rest of the states have made it illegal. So which has effectively driven tenancy underground. The rents are absurd. Typically, the rent is 50% of the produce. No agricultural activity can generate, a return which will enable someone to pay a, rent of 50% of the produce. So today, the biggest pro-poor thing, and this I've said in several policy forums, including the successor to Dr. Alag's former employer, the Niti Aayog, that if we are going to move forward, even on productivity and production issues, a solution to land leasing is important. So I've said, number 1, about aggregation, producer organizations. Number 2, I've talked about mechanization. Number 3, I'm saying we need something on trade policy. See, one of the reasons why investment is not going into warehousing, which is a prerequisite for commodity financing, is that the marketing structures are still so rigid that farmers are not incentivized enough to invest in technology for high production, because the end markets are artificially closed. If I'm, making this cable in this country, I can sell it anywhere in the world. But if I'm growing wheat in a particular district of the country, I'm obliged by law to take it to be sold in the nearest mandi. How is that? How is this freedom which is available to a chap who can manufacture a pen or a pin not available to a farmer who's facing a much bigger set of risks, where the risk price is the rest of it. So we need to do something about our trade policy. The world looks at us almost with fear as a potential agri-giant, but we seem to be almost afraid of our own strength. So every year the policy changes, and the world does not look upon us as a reliable supplier. And therefore, long-term value chains, long-term contracts don't happen in this country. Basmati is an exception, and you can see how we have taken the pole position in the world. Because one item the government does not, tinker around with, it's very big. In marine products, we are the world's largest exporter. In buffalo meat, I know sensitive subject, but in buffalo meat we are the world's biggest exporter. Merely because there was no tinkering, no short-term tinkering with policy. But if you look at cereals, now pulses, we of course are the world's biggest producer and biggest consumer because we are a largely vegetarian country. But the fact is that till about 6-7 years ago, when we were allowing the export of pulses, farmers actually had an incentive. There are parts of Madhya Pradesh where the pulses were only grown for export, because there were international value chains which would have advanced contracts with those producers because of the taste and, let's say, some limited features of those crops. We could still do that, but without a long-term or at least a medium-term policy on agricultural trade, we're not going anywhere. And the last point which I want to say is that skilling to enable our producers to shift to other occupations, and this sounds counterintuitive sometimes. So what I'm suggesting is we need to put in a policy to take off at least 15 to 20% of the population dependent on agriculture in the next 20 years. And that would be a wonderful achievement, incidentally. I don't think that today we have a plan, but without that plan, we are not going anywhere, and certainly we are not going anywhere in inviting greater investment in agriculture. Dr. Alag knows this. The input-output ratio in agriculture is the most favorable. To get 1 rupee of output, you need to put in only 4 rupees. But the best part is that growth in agriculture is at least twice more effective in reducing poverty than growth in industry or services. So, in the presence of this brilliant audience, I hope to go back by the end of the day, or at least when I have to leave at lunch, with some cogent and concrete ideas. Thank you so much for your patient attention, and I look forward to your inputs. Thank you.